Life was going as normal for a man living with his small family, seeking to build a stable future in a new home he had carefully chosen. Everything seemed perfect, until a moment came when his life was turned upside down, as his new home turned into the scene of a horrific crime he had never imagined. The tale begins with the family moving into the new villa, but soon everything changes when the wife and daughter mysteriously disappear, and the man finds himself in front of a nightmare he did not expect. What actually happened? There was a man who lived with his family in one of the cities, without mentioning its name, and he was looking for a suitable place to build his villa. After a period of searching, he found a site he liked and decided to buy it and build the villa there. The neighborhood was still modern and under construction, with only a few villas. The man continued to work on building his villa until it was completed and fully equipped, and then decided to move to it from his first house. His wife told the maid helping her with the housework that they were moving to the new villa, and gave her new address. Indeed, the man moved in with his wife and only daughter, who was 21 and studying at the university. They liked the new area. It was still newly built. Although the villa was relatively far from the maid's house, she kept coming every morning to do her usual chores and returning in the evening to her home where she lived with her husband and children. The man worked in a high position in the state. His daughter was busy with her university studies, while his wife spent her time at home and sometimes visited her family, who lived in the same city. Things were going well until one day the man received a shocking call informing him of his sister's death. Deeply saddened, he began preparing himself to travel to the funeral. She told his wife and daughter that they would accompany him to comfort his family. On the way, he called his employer and asked for leave, so it was agreed to give him temporary leave to stay with his mother during this difficult period. Upon his arrival, the family offered their condolences, and he decided to stay with his mother for some time to comfort her. 2 days later, she told his wife that they had to go back because their daughter had important exams 3 days later. The husband agreed that they should come back and told his wife, "You should come back with our daughter to prepare for her exams." When she asked him why he had not returned with them, he told her that he would stay longer with his mother. The wife and daughter left for the city where they lived, and upon their arrival, they found the maid waiting for them at the door of the villa. They entered the house, and the maid prepared some food for them before she started doing her chores. Then the wife told her that she would have dinner with her daughter at her family's house that night, and asked her to leave early. The maid rejoiced that she would return home early, as she used to come back late. The next morning, the maid came to the villa and started knocking repeatedly, but received no reply. She thought that the lady might have asked her mother to sleep over, so she went back to her house. But the next day, the day of the man's daughter's exam, the maid returned early to do chores. She knocked on the door many times, but there was no response, which worried her. "I tried calling the house phone, but to no avail. Then, I called the servant who worked for the man and told him." The man asked her if the lady had told her about her intention to go somewhere, and she replied that she had just gone with her daughter to her mother's house for dinner, and they were supposed to come back at night. The man was worried and asked the maid to go home, saying he would call his in-laws to inquire. He called his wife, but her phone was off, so was his daughter's. Then, he decided to call his mother-in-law and ask her if his daughter and wife had spent the night there, and she replied that they had come for dinner, but they did not stay overnight, as his wife left angry after a dispute with her younger brother. The man's fears increased. How could his wife's and daughter's phones be turned off and they did not come home? He remembered that while at the funeral, his daughter had used his phone to call a friend about her studies. He started searching his phone for that friend's number and called her. When the girl replied, he said to her, "Peace be upon you," and she replied, "Peace be upon you, uncle." He asked her, "Are you my daughter's friend?" She replied, "Yes, I am her friend." He asked her, "Did you attend the exam today?" She said, "No, she did not attend. I have called her since the morning, but her phone is off." At that point, the man felt very anxious, and realizing that something serious had happened, he he decided to return immediately to his city to check what was going on. All the way, anxiety gripped him, and he felt things weren't looking good. The man returned to his city in the evening, at the height of anxiety and tension due to the interruption of communication with his wife and daughter and the closure of their phones. When he reached his villa, he opened the large gate and then inserted the key into the lock of the main door, but was surprised that it was not locked. He pushed the door and entered, noticing that there were traces of blood starting from the threshold, and the villa was in a state of complete chaos. The furniture was upside down and everything was scattered throughout the place. Terrified and traumatized, these signs never bode well. He pulled himself together and stepped inside the house, shaking his voice at his wife and daughter, but received no response. He began looking for them in every room, and in every corner he found traces of blood. When he reached one of the rooms and opened the door, he was struck by a shocking shock that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He found his wife and daughter lying on the ground, drenched in their own blood, but what made it even scarier was the way they were found, as they were in an unspeakably tragic situation. The man felt a shock that he had never expected, as he thought the worst that could happen was that they would be robbed or assaulted, but he could not imagine that they would be liquidated in this hideous way. He came out of the villa in a state of complete collapse, and ran towards his workplace, where he worked as a police officer of great rank. He entered without paying attention to his colleagues who were standing at the entrance and talking to him, as his focus was all on the door of the headquarters. His colleagues noticed that something was wrong, and they asked him, "What is wrong with you? What happened?" But he could barely speak, and then he said in a voice suffocated by sadness and amazement, "My wife and daughter have been liquidated." His colleagues did not believe what they heard, so they asked him again, "What are you saying?" But he was in shock, and he started grabbing his head and crying, repeating, "My wife and daughter are liquidated." The police rushed to escort him to the scene, and when they entered the villa, they prevented him from entering the room where the two victims were found. The scenes were very horrific. The teams specializing in criminal investigation arrived, and they began to collect evidence, as the wife and daughter were found bound in a brutal manner, their mouths closed with duct tape. Investigators began their work meticulously, lifted fingerprints from the crime scene, and sent the bodies to forensics by order of the prosecution. They also searched the entire villa, including the garden, but no weapon or tool was found that might have been used in the crime. The lock on the garden door as well as the villa door was observed to have been broken, indicating that the perpetrator had forcibly entered the premises. Since the villa was in disarray, it was initially thought that the motive was theft, but the way the two victims were killed showed that it was more complicated than just a robbery. Investigators asked the man to check his belongings to see if anything had been stolen. Despite his extreme shock, the man tried to hold on and began to check his belongings, telling them, "The smashed box had my wife and daughter's gold in it." Then they asked him to check if something else was missing, so he opened a drawer where he was holding a sum of money, and said, "There were about $1.5 million, maybe a little more. There are precious watches," he added, "but I don't know if they're still there." Investigators headed to the garage, where they found his wife's car, showing that she had already returned to the villa before the murder. They noticed that the man was exhausted and unable to concentrate well due to the trauma. They advised him to rest, but assured him that they would continue to work on the case until the perpetrator was apprehended. The next morning, the man returned to headquarters, where the investigation began to run its course. Investigators inquired about the last call he had with his wife and daughter, and he told them that the last contact was the day they returned from the funeral, as his wife informed him that they had arrived home safely. Since then, he has never contacted them again. The man called the maid who worked for them in the villa and asked her if she had noticed something strange. She told him that she had knocked on the door in the morning and no one had answered her, and she thought that the wife might have spent the night at her mother's house. But when he called his mother-in-law, she told him that his daughter and wife had left her house before dinner because of a disagreement with her younger brother. The police continued to investigate, asking the man if he had enemies or disagreements with anyone, and he replied in the negative, "No, I don't have any enmities, neither I nor my family. Investigators requested the maid's address, and sent a squad to bring her to headquarters for questioning, as she might have useful information. At the same time, the cops started asking the neighbors and the neighborhood guard about any suspicious movements. But the surprise was that the neighbors and the guard didn't notice anything suspicious, and they didn't see anyone entering or leaving the villa last night. When the interrogators asked them if they had heard strange sounds, such as screams, noises, or the sound of things falling, everyone answered in the negative. This raised the surprise of the police. So how is it possible that a crime of this ugliness occurs in a villa next to them, without anyone hearing any sound or seeing any suspicious movement? Questions began to multiply, and it became clear that the case was not just an ordinary theft incident, but behind it a dangerous secret that must be revealed. At that moment, when the policemen were continuing to question the neighbors, they asked if anyone had surveillance cameras that might help the investigation, but the neighbors replied that they did not have any cameras. However, one of them pointed out that there was a night guard in the neighborhood, and they said to him, "Where's the guard now?" "He only comes at night," replied one woman, "and we don't have a day guard." Investigators inquired about the night watchman's address, but the lady said she did not know where he lived. Then, a neighbor intervened, saying, "I know him and I know where he lives." The policeman asked him to show them his address and, indeed, he took them to his house, which was a little far from the neighborhood. When they arrived, they knocked on the door, and the guard opened to them and asked, "Peace be upon you, who are you?" They said, "We are the police, and we need some information from you, come with us." The guard accompanied them to the police headquarters, where they began to question him. They asked him, "Do you work in the guard of the so-and-so neighborhood?" "Yes, that's right." Then they asked him, "When do you start your business?" He replied, "I start after sunset and stay until dawn." They continued to interrogate him, "Do you know all the residents of the neighborhood?" "Of course," he said, "I've been working there for years." Then they asked him, "Did you see the victim, i.e. the wife and daughter, on the day of the accident? Did you notice them going out or coming home?" "No," he replied in the negative, "I never saw them that day." After completing the investigation with him, they allowed him to leave, and then the police went to the wife's family for questioning. She was first questioned by the victim's mother, but she was not aware of anything, as her son-in-law did not tell her what had happened. She thought her daughter hadn't answered the phone because she might have been angry or busy. But when she saw the cops asking about her, she got very anxious and started wondering why these questions. They told her that she should accompany them to the police headquarters, where she would be briefed on the details. They asked her, "Who lives with you at home?" "I live with my eldest son, my daughter, and my youngest son," she replied. They asked her to call her eldest son and daughter to come with them to the police headquarters, but she told them that her youngest son is not at home, and may be with his friends. The policemen took the mother and her two sons to the headquarters, and there they began to question them individually, to compare their statements. The mother said, "My daughter and granddaughter came to me in the evening, and she found me making dinner. My daughter kept talking to her older brother, while I was busy in the kitchen. I asked her about her husband, and she told me that he had gone to another city for a funeral, and that she had only come home with her daughter. At that moment," she continued, "my little boy came in with a cigarette, and his older sister scolded him, saying, 'Don't you respect anyone in this house?' But he paid no attention to her and kept smoking in front of all of us, which made her get angry and decide to leave with her daughter. I tried to convince her to stay for dinner, but she refused," the mother added. "As for my little boy, he kept standing smoking without saying a word, as if he didn't care." "Does your son use drugs?" The mother hesitated a little and then said in a low voice, "He only smokes cigarettes, God guides him." But when they questioned the elder brother, his answers matched those of his mother, except for one point. When asked if his younger brother was an addict, he replied bluntly, "He does drugs and alcohol, and maybe more than that, God knows." the cops realized that the mother might have been trying to cover for her young son, either out of shame or fear for him. But the elder brother was not hiding anything. He said, "I always told my mother to stop him and watch him, but she refused, arguing that brothers should not quarrel. She always said to me, 'Don't fight with your brother, he's still young.' But she didn't realize that he had used her kindness to go too far." The older brother then added, "My older sister was always trying to advise him, but she was the only one who dared to raise his voice in her face. When she came to visit us with her daughter, she saw him smoking, so she started scolding him and telling him, 'How many times have I told you to stay away from these bad habits? Haven't you learned your lesson yet?' But he could not stand her words and began to respond to her nervously, so she decided to leave." "When did your sister and daughter leave?" "I think she left around dinner time," he replied. Then they asked him, "And where was your younger brother then?" "He went out angry," he said, "and didn't come home until 10 o'clock at night." The sister was also questioned, and her statements were exactly identical to those of the mother and the elder brother. At this point, the cops decided to wait for the younger brother to come home. Indeed, when he returned late, they took him to police headquarters for questioning. He started shouting, "Let go of me! I didn't do nothing! I didn't do nothing! I swear! But the policemen didn't formally arrest him, they took him in for interrogation. When he arrived at headquarters, they asked him, "Where were you last night?" "I was with my friends." "Why are you asking? Did your sister and daughter come home that day?" "Yes," he replied, "she came." "What time?" "I'm not sure," he said, "but I think it arrived a little before sunset." "And when did you leave?" He hesitated a little and then said, "Maybe around 6 o'clock or a little bit more, I'm not sure." Police officers' suspicions began to swirl around him, especially because of his confusion and the lack of clarity of his answers. When the investigators questioned the young man, they asked him directly, "Exactly, why did you fight with your sister?" "Yes," he replied, "we had a fight. This was the first time she saw me smoking, so she got angry and scolded me, then went out of the house angry." They asked him, "And what did she do after she left? Did you stay home or did you go out?" He replied, "My brother and sister kept fighting with me, and I saw my mother angry and upset, so I decided to go out to change the atmosphere." "Where did she go?" "I went to the coffee shop and met my friends there," he said. "When did you get home?" "About 10 o'clock, he replied, "and when I came back, I found that they had finished dinner and left me nothing." Investigators noticed that his statements matched those of the rest of the family, but they needed more evidence to confirm his statements. Therefore, they gathered information about his friends with whom he claimed to have been with, and then summoned them one by one to interrogate them. They also investigated the cafe waiter who confirmed that he was actually there at the time, giving the young man a strong alibi. Family trauma. Meanwhile, investigators informed the victim's mother and siblings that the wife and daughter had been killed inside the villa. The shock was so strong on all of them that at first they didn't believe what they had heard. The forensic report came out revealing horrific details, as it confirmed that the mother and daughter were killed in the same way, as both of them were subjected to one sharp stab in the abdomen that was enough to end their lives. The report also noted that the crime took place at a specific time, the same time the victim left her family home. More shockingly, however, the report revealed that the two victims had been assaulted before they were killed, demonstrating that the perpetrators had planned their crime and taken their precautions carefully. Back to investigations. Investigators decided to question the woman who had been helping the wife with housework, especially since she had recently visited the villa and asked if the victim had returned. They questioned her about her whereabouts at the time of the crime, verified her statements, and found that she was not involved in the case. So, they let her go. Despite extensive investigations, the investigators were unable to come up with any conclusive evidence, as all the suspects had strong alibis. However, the investigators kept doubting everyone, because the case was too vague. Investigations continued, and the commissioner was following the case closely, as he desperately wanted to know who killed his wife and daughter, and he was telling his team, "Keep looking, we must find the culprit as soon as possible." Villa inspection. The commissioner decided to return to the villa he had not visited since the crime, as he was in a state of shock that prevented him from focusing on the details of what had been stolen from the house. This time, he began to scrutinize each corner thoroughly. Note that some precious decorations have disappeared, which are handmade decorative pieces that were placed on shelves in the living room. It occurred to him that the thief might try to sell it in one of the shops specializing in decorations or even in popular markets. Therefore, he added this information to the investigation file and decided to search the markets himself for these pieces. Tracking stolen items. The commissioner drove off, visited several shops and markets, but found no trace of the stolen decorations. At the same time, police teams were continuing to investigate and search all possible places. They also questioned the commissioner's daughter's friends, but the police did not get any useful information from any of them. The questions kept puzzling everyone. Who killed the wife and her daughter? Why? Was the crime motivated by theft or revenge? The big breakthrough in the case. After a long period of searching without any progress, while the commissioner was passing through one of the popular markets, he suddenly glimpsed a piece of stolen decor for sale. He immediately stopped his car and got down as he tried to adjust his temper so as not to arouse suspicion. He approached the seller, who was displaying his goods on a large carpet with old radios, mobile phones and some decorations. The commissioner took one of the pieces as if he was interested in buying it, and the seller asked him, "You likes it? This is one of the finest pieces I have." The commissioner replied, "Yes, it looks great." Untranslated_content_start. Untranslated_content_end. The merchant replied, "This is our profession, we know how to obtain such rare pieces." At that moment, the commissioner felt angry but held on, then said to the seller, "They seem to be made outside, don't they?" The seller responded confidently, "Yes, it's a workmanship, do you want me to sell it to you at a good price?" The commissioner asked him, "How much is it?" The seller replied, "Only 200 dirhams, and I win with you." At that moment, the policeman broke into the place and arrested the seller, confiscating all the merchandise on offer. The seller was shocked and asked, "What is it? Why did you stop me?" They took him to the police headquarters for questioning, where the commissioner knew that this moment might be the starting point for exposing the real killer. Here they said to him, "Where did you get this decor?" "I bought it from someone," he said. They asked him, "Who is this person?" "I don't know him," he replied. "Was he alone?" "No," he said, "he had someone else with him." "And where did he sell it to you?" He said to them, "He found me in the same place where you took me now, where I was putting my merchandise up for sale. One of my friends was standing next to me, and two young men came to him and offered him the decor, but he did not agree to the price they asked for. Then they came to me and asked me if I was going to buy it, and I told them how much I could pay, and they agreed and took the money and left, and that's it." The policeman asked him for his friend's address, so he gave it to them, so he too was brought in and interrogated, so his story was exactly the same as his friend's. Meanwhile, the results of the fingerprint report arrived, and the surprise was that the fingerprints belonged to two clear people. The policeman continued to search for the identity of the fingerprints, completed the investigation of these two vendors, and asked them to describe the people who sold them the decorations. They said, one was plump and had a thick mustache, the other was short and slightly brown, and they were wearing certain clothes. After completing their investigation, the police obtained permission from the public prosecution to search their homes, but found no evidence against them, and released them. At that moment, the identities of the fingerprint holders, two people known to the police for their criminal record, arrived. The police began an intensive search for them, and upon their arrest, each of them was investigated separately. Why did you kill the victims?" "We didn't kill anyone." But the detective, after noticing his recklessness and provocative manner of speaking, hit the table with his hand and said to him, "We are not asking you if you did it or not, we are asking you why you killed them." Here, the criminal felt confused and kept silent. The detective said to him, "Are you going to talk or should we make you talk?" The criminal said, "Okay, I'll confess. We carried out the crime, but we were following someone else's orders." The investigator was surprised and asked him, "What do you mean? And who asked you to carry out the crime?" "Why?" He replied, "Al-Asas, the neighborhood guard, is the one who told us about the villa." The investigators were very surprised, because during the previous investigation the guard seemed to be affected, as if he had nothing to do with the case. They sent a team to bring him in, and in the process, they continued to question the culprits. The criminal said, "At first, it was the guard who showed us the villa, and told us that the owners were not at home, because the wife and her daughter went to her family, while the husband was in Tetuan. As soon as the guard came out, we broke into the villa by breaking the lock, but suddenly we heard the sound of a car entering the garage. At that moment," he continued, "my friend and I hid in a dark corner, and when the lady came in with her daughter, we grabbed them and tied them up and put duct tape over their mouths so the neighbors wouldn't hear them. At first, we did not intend to kill them, but when we saw that they recognized us, we were afraid that they would expose us, so we decided to kill them." The perpetrator was recounting the details, but he could not describe some of the moments because of the ugliness of the crime. "Did you assault the victims before killing them?" He kept silent for a moment, then said, "Yes." The investigator completed the investigation of the other perpetrator, and he, too, confessed to the same story. The police took their phones and asked, "Do you have the guard's phone number?" "No," they said, "we were communicating with him via private numbers." "When was your last contact?" "It was only yesterday," one of them replied. "He called us to ask to split the money." Here, the police confirmed that the guard thought that the case had calmed down, so he called his partners to claim his share of the loot. When the guard was summoned for interrogation, he thought it was just an ordinary interrogation. "What's your relationship to criminals?" "I don't know them," he replied. The detective took out their pictures and said, "Are these your friends?" "No man, I ain't never seen these dudes." But the detective pulled out the phone of one of the perpetrators, called the guard's number, and the guard's phone started ringing inside his pocket. At that moment, the guard was stunned, wishing the earth had split open and swallowed him. But the surprise didn't end here. When the guard started talking, he admitted something shocking that no one expected, saying, "So-and-so is the cause of all this." The investigator asked him, "Who is so-and-so?" "It's the maid who used to work in the villa and help the victim with housework," he replied. "And how is that?" And he said, "She's the one who planned everything." The investigator asked him, "Why? What do you care?" "She's my mistress," he replied. "She told me that the owners of the house are wealthy, and they have a safe full of gold and money. She told me every detail of their movements, and when the house was empty. Based on that, I made the plan with the perpetrators, and the goal was just to steal, but when the victim and her daughter suddenly came back, things developed into a murder." The guard admitted that he cut off contact with the criminals after the crime, but when the financial conditions tightened, he called them again to claim his share. The police immediately moved to fetch the maid. At first, she tried to pretend she was innocent, but investigators confronted her with evidence, including her phone number found in the guard's call log. Here, she collapsed and started crying, saying, "I was tempted by the devil, I didn't expect things to get to killing." But her tears did not intercede for her, the evidence was overwhelming against her and against everyone. All were tried, the culprits were sentenced to death, while the guard and maid were sentenced to life imprisonment. Thus, the case ended, but it revealed a terrifying truth: there are many monsters living among us with human masks. And so, that was the end of the case, and we'll see you on another case in the next episode. Be careful, and take care of yourself.